Um, the final presentation that we have today is actually myself. Hopefully, hopefully, the can everybody see the screen coming up?
Yeah. It's visible.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, sorry. My name is Maurice Brady, and I'm with the School of Transport Engineering, Environmental and Planning in Technological University, Dublin. Now, we only changed our name about a year and a half ago, so we're still getting used to it. You may have heard us as being the DIT, the Dublin Institute of Technology. And this morning, I just want to give a very quick overview on a piece of research that's actually in train at the minute. It's entitled "The Mutuality of Social Sustainability and Supply Chain Resilience in a Micro Enterprise Context." And really, there's a lot of ideas hitting off each other here. And really, what I want to do this morning is kind of just lay it out in terms of, well, what do we mean about sustainability, social sustainability? In our sense, what do we mean in terms of resilience, and why are we starting to get interested in terms of the micro enterprise context? So really, it's just to kind of contextualize all of these and kind of showcase how these ideas started to bounce off each other and how we ended up looking at this together. Okay, so in terms of the agenda, it's really looking at supply chain resilience, it's looking at social sustainability and the micro enterprise. And this really comes off a piece of research that I did last year in terms of supply chain resilience in the context of Brexit. Okay, you know, again within the Irish economy, Brexit is a monumental effect. It looks like, you know, once we get a final decision on exactly what do we mean by Brexit and how do we react to it is probably that'll be more telling, I suppose, at the time. But I suppose one of the things that we see with resilience, it's a funny sort of idea and it's a funny sort of context or a funny principle, because we know that we wanted it. You know, every supply chain manager wants resilience. Everybody wants resilience within their own being. Everybody wants an organizational resilience. But there's a bit of a dichotomy here in terms of, well, how do we know that we are resilient? How do we know that you can come to the end and say, okay, well, look, I've actually displayed some resilience here. And this is one of the issues that brought up the initial research in terms of Brexit, in terms of saying to a supply chain manager, when were you resilient? Can you demonstrate your resilience? And there's a little bit of a difficulty in that, in the sense that we can't, in many cases, it's difficult to grab onto something and say, that's where I was resilient. And when we look at the literature that has preceded all of this, we see that really it's going to, you know, I've just have some ideas, some previous definitions in terms of resilience within supply chain. And really it kind of comes down to the two broad areas in terms of what do we mean by resilience. There's always going to be a disruption event. There's always going to be something that's going to affect what we do. Now that can be positive or it can be negative. Generally, we're going to react to a negative situation. But there's always something that's going to be there in terms of we do something and there's an external factor that comes in and says, okay, well, you cannot do that anymore. In the initial study, it was Brexit. So how are we going to deal with Brexit? But the real question then is, in order to display resilience, where is that end point? Where is that point where you can say, okay, well, look, there, I have become resilient? And it falls into two broad camps. There's the definition that says, okay, well, look, you've had the disruption event, you've reacted to it, and you've been able to resume normal operations. So there's a level of robustness there. There's a level of strength. There's a level of preparedness in terms of being ready, take the disruption event, and then return to normal. But there's the other camp that's actually making an argument saying, okay, well, look, do you really want to return to your normal operations? Or can you learn in terms of what's happening here? Now, I suppose the idea of learning then brings us into a new area in terms of the likes of our innovation, optimism, entrepreneurship. So there's a lot of kind of softer skills there in terms of learning and adapting. And as part of the research, I did take the idea that growth was part of that strategy. It was part of the resilience cycle. Okay. And we were able to break down resilience into these 4 areas in terms of ready, respond, recover, growth. Okay. Now, really, that brings up the next question in terms of, well, how do you be ready? What do you need in order to respond? What capabilities do you need for recovery? And what do you have to embed in your strategy in order to grow? And it's one of these things where you break down one thing and then you realize, well, there's more issues here. As part of the study, as part of the original study, I used Carl et al. 2018. Now, in that research, there's 13 broad enablers of a resilient strategy. So the argument here is that it's not complete, but in a very generalized or generalizable framework, we're going to say, well, there's 13 enablers that you must have in any strategy if you're going to be resilient. So the interesting thing was in the initial study, I went to the industry who are preparing for Brexit, and there was essentially 2 questions and 2 pieces of information that came out. It was, can we accept growth as part of the resilience strategy? And within each phase of the resilience strategy, well, what's the most important? Where do you feel is the most important factor? Okay, what enabler is the one that you really, really need to embed? And as part of that study, we found, well, actually, that growth was deemed the most important. This was the area, this was this phase or the cycle. This was the element that the supply chain managers responded and said, well, when we're thinking about resilience, this is where we're really thinking about. This is where we're really putting our emphasis. In terms of enablers, visibility and supply chain design, agility and trust came out on top. Now, what all of this meant is if we analyze it somewhat, and this is where this piece of research is going, it's looking and essentially breaking down these skills or these enablers into your softer kind of skills and your harder kind of skills, okay? And again, it's early days in terms of saying, well, definitely, this is definitely soft, this is going to be categorized as a hard skill. But certainly what we can see is that if we're going to look at resilience as being a growth factor, if we're going to be looking at resilience in terms of growth, not just in terms of readiness, where readiness is a very passive, it's a very passive trait in terms of trying to be strong, trying to have redundancy, trying to be very, very controlled and being very robust. If we compare that to the likes of growth, which is much more active, it's much more involved in agility, it's much more involved in innovation, much more involved in entrepreneurship. What we're seeing is that in a growth strategy, we're really seeing a lot more of those softer skills and the ability to react to a situation in an optimistic and an opportunistic manner. So we're beginning to see, if we accept growth as being part of the resilience strategy, we're beginning to see the softer skills come to the fore. Now, the second part of this research is the idea of sustainability. Now, again, I think we all accept that we're really looking at the social, environmental, and economic element of sustainability. This has been long discussed, it's been long highlighted. But the other thing that we're seeing in terms of in terms of sustainability is that we're seeing that the social element is oftentimes neglected. And indeed, in a piece of research by Nakambia in 2017 that looked at social sustainability within supply chain sustainability, there was only 5 recognizable and useful definitions in terms of what is social sustainability. So again, we're kind of, it would be nicer, I suppose, to be able to hang on and say, this is a definitive this is what we really mean by social sustainability. So, but when we look at social sustainability, and I like this quotation, I like this definition, where it's related to the management of practices, capabilities, stakeholders, and resources to address human potential. So very similar to our resilience in terms of growth, where we're really beginning to see that the person is coming to the fore. So when we're talking about social sustainability, we're really asking, well, are we really doing the right thing in terms of the people that our supply chain affects? Are we really getting the highest level of potential out of our stakeholders who are involved in the process? So are we getting enough from our employees? Are we giving enough to our employees? Are we helping our community? Are we part of the community? Is our supply chain, is our operation, is our enterprise, is it a factor in a positive way, in a long-term manner, for anybody that we affect? So straight away here, we've got kind of two elements here in terms of social sustainability and resilience, where we begin to see that it's really person-centric. And indeed, it's kind of, in many ways, it's going back to that basic idea of what is supply chain, what skills do you need? Definitely there's functional skills needed. But again, we can categorize the skills down into relational skills and behavioral skills. And we can really see that it's coming back to that idea that it's person-centric and getting the most out of the person, getting the most out of the person or the people that our supply chain affects. So on the face of it, when we look at it, we could think, well, the microenterprise, it could be the perfect test bed to look at this. Because when we look at the microenterprise, within Europe, we would define a microenterprise as an enterprise or business that's got less than 10 employees, got less than 2 million euro in terms of turnover or on the balance sheet. So these are smaller businesses, okay? Obviously smaller than medium enterprises, smaller than your large enterprises. And as I said, look, it would have seemed to be the perfect test bed. It would seem to be the area that we can really delve into. It's the one that we can really go and say, okay, well, look, resilience, we feel is very person-centric. It's very much about the person responding to a situation, okay? And again, we can make an argument that organizational resilience is built on personal resilience. Social sustainability is based on the idea of people. And if we look at a business that's got a small amount of people within it, we can make an argument and say, okay, well, look, chances are, and I'm using that term at the minute because we don't have the final results, we could make an argument to say, look, chances are that we could learn from the microenterprise and apply upscale it. Now, we would make that argument because we tend to find that the microenterprise it's entrepreneurial. It is a person who has decided themselves that they will create a business. It is a business that really reflects the person who owns it and operates it. And indeed, in many cases, it is generally the owner who is also the operator. So we really tend to find there is a correlation between the personal attributes of the owner of the business in a microenterprise and the way that the enterprise actually reacts in the market, how the enterprise actually behaves in the market, how does it adhere to rules, regulations, how does it focus on key issues, how does it deal with risk events. And we see that there is a correlation back to the ownership, and there's the personal attributes of the owner really reflect into the responses of the business. Which is interesting because the business itself has some difficulties in terms of being personally or person-centric. One of the issues we would see is tactic knowledge. So whilst knowledge management and knowledge transfer is very important in terms of a resilient strategy, what we see is that in a microenterprise situation, the procedures and the protocols and the systems for knowledge transfer are not necessarily in place. We find that the microenterprise is very diverse in terms of the way that it does business. Again, it's a business that has more than likely, and again, hopefully next year I'll be able to present the findings, but more than likely has organically grown which means that the systems and procedures are not necessarily in place. So when it comes to knowledge transfer, for instance, we don't necessarily have the systems in place. Now, is that a bad thing or a good thing? Hopefully next year we'll have those results to be able to say, okay, well, look, actually, maybe there are no set systems in place, no standard operating procedures, but maybe we'll see that there is a softer or a less rigorous system of knowledge transfer. The other issue we see is access to social capital. Now, again, we'll go back to something that I mentioned earlier in terms of the idea that all of the resilience strategy is very person-centric. The social sustainability is person-centric. The microenterprise is very person-centric. It's more or less a representation of the person who created this business. But we find that it's in a very tight framework. And one of the issues that we see with microenterprises is access to finance. So it was interesting that it was brought up in terms of the keynote speaker this morning, in terms of finance and access to it is something that we need to look at. Because in a microenterprise setting, the access to the finance is limited. So when it comes to hiring in staff, when it comes to accessing or using or utilizing the services of consultancies and consulting firms, microenterprises are at a deficit. So what we're seeing is that a microenterprise will grow organically. We'll see that the skill sets that are within the firm are going to be stable. It's going to be difficult for a firm to keep developing skills and to get that outside knowledge. Now, and this is one of the things that really interested me because, as I said, on the face of it, the microenterprise should be a perfect test bed. It should be the perfect area to learn from in terms of being person-centric and getting the most from people within your supply chain, people within your firm. But we're actually seeing that the characteristics of the enterprise within itself is not lending itself to being supportive of a resilient strategy or supportive of always being in line with social expectations. So that has led to the situation where there's essentially two broad questions. Okay, is there a relationship between social sustainability and supply chain resilience? So can we say within a microenterprise setting, if you're socially sustainable, are you 80% of the way there in terms of being resilient? So if you implement one strategy, is there an automatic correlation into the second strategy? And again, one of the things we see is that resilience and sustainability are highly linked, because to be resilient means that you want to deal with adversities, you want to deal with disruptions, you want to grow and continue your operations, which is the very ethos of sustainability. Now, what we see is that when margins are tight, when there's a lot of pressure on, we start to see that sustainability maybe goes to one side and we focus on economics. But the question here is, within a micro-enterprise setting, is there something that we can learn? Is there, if you implement one, will the other automatically start to increase? And likewise, can we use social sustainability as a framework for resilience? So it's repeating that idea that if we know how to get social sustainability in, if we know how to frame it in a micro-enterprise setting, is resilience then going to be easy and quick to implement? So it's really, this research is really going to be answering those questions in terms of, if we do one, will the other automatically come in? Or is there a dichotomy between the two concepts and they should be treated differently, or should they be treated within the same? So as I said, look, it's a work in progress. I really hope that I'll be back next year, maybe hopefully all in a room together, and I'll be able to discuss the results and we'll have something that comes out of it. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, here's my details, or if you want to know more about the research, or if you have any questions that you want to ask, you can ask them now, or you can send them to my email. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Maurice. I think some of these some of the ideas from your paper can also be very, very relevant to many micro enterprises in New Zealand, because we have got many micro enterprises in New Zealand. As per your definition, less than 10 employees, we have got so many. So
Yeah.
I just want to want to add one point. Is it specifically relevant to micro enterprises, or can some of the ideas from your paper can some of the ideas from your paper be used in bigger companies as well, bigger enterprises?
I think it can be. I think look, I suppose it's a little bit early to come up with a definitive response to that. But the initial research that kind of that made this grow was largely dependent on large enterprise respondents. So the idea that growth is an accepted element of the resilience cycle, that's really been driven by the larger companies. Likewise, what we see is that the larger companies have those processes for knowledge management. They have those processes to encourage trust within their supply chain. So the larger firms are really able to, they should be able to grasp onto those personal attributes, you know, that idea of personal resilience. They should be able to capture that. So I think we can be learning from the larger firms. I think the larger firm is going to have a lot more of those processes in place. And then it's to allow the micro enterprise to give them the scope, or to give them the room to look at this and go, okay, well, yeah, I need to concentrate on it. It could be the case, and again, this is where the results will bear this out. It could be the case that micro enterprises are already doing this, but it's not in a formalized manner. And it's about, again, it's about framing that out and seeing whether they are actually doing it, and whether we can learn from that in terms of how the larger firm can allow this to happen more organically. So I think both parties can really learn from each other.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Maurice. And thank you for chairing this session very nicely.
My pleasure. It was really interesting. Look, I think we won't mention the last presentation, but certainly the two presentations at the beginning were really interesting. Really learned a lot from it. And I hope everybody enjoyed it, and I hope everybody learned from it. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.